Hey guys, so this is how we took Maggie, an under-18 basketball player, from post-surgery for lateral meniscus repair through to being in peak condition for national championships representing her state, Queensland. So immediately post-surgery, as with a lot of knee surgeries, there's a lot of muscle weakness and a little bit of inhibition through the quads, which is quite common. So we really had to address this, and of course range of motion. So just coming through the basic stuff that you normally address with knee surgeries post-surgery. So one of the big focus for a lot of people is trying to restore as much knee flexion as they can as quickly as possible, and absolutely I agree with that. That's par for the course. One thing I really want to focus on as well though at that time is trying to restore knee extension, so completely straightening the knee as quickly as we can. The reason for this is because without full knee extension, we can't actually walk properly. We rely on full knee extension for the gait cycle. We don't need full flexion for the gait cycle. So one of our key objectives initially was restoring normal gait after the surgery and being inactive, being off that leg for so long. So knee extension was the key. We then used some isometric work to start getting more strength and more activation through the quads, trying to overcome some of the inhibition from inactivity, which worked really well, and then progressing through into some very low-level eccentrics just to facilitate that even further. So we're now at a point where gait cycles start to be restored. Where do we go from here? So in basketball, as in all sports, running is going to be a key part of it. So we could potentially go and start getting some running work happening, jogging, this kind of thing. But instead of doing that, I prefer to rely on run-specific isometric strength training, which basically looks at, are athletes strong enough to run quickly yet? And we saw in Maggie's case with testing that she really wasn't strong enough yet on that left side. So when we're looking at the testing from the force plate data, it's really interesting because very often post-surgery, we might have to rely on just looking at symmetries. How does the left leg compare to the right leg? The issue with this though is that the non-injured limb has also had a detraining effect. So to have a detrained limb as like the pinnacle or the level we're trying to get to for the injured limb is not always a great idea. Sometimes it's all you have, so you just roll with that. Fortunately though, I've been working with Maggie for a little while, so we had a lot of data from our force plate testing from months and years gone by. So we kind of had a goal of, okay, when you are at your peak, this is the level you're at in terms of force production at the hamstrings, the quads, this kind of thing. This is the level you're at in terms of force production through isometric testing, through counter movement jump testing. These are the jump heights as well. So we have some really great markers there to start aiming for as targets. And that for me is a much better situation than simply relying on trying to get the left back up to the same as the right or the uninjured limb. Because if we just pursue trying to restore function to the uninjured limb, we might end up having nice balance, nice symmetry there, two symmetrical limbs, but they might both be weak. It's a tough argument, but in my view, better to have asymmetry among two limbs, but both of them be strong enough for what is required. Unfortunately, we had the data to know what levels we're looking at there, so that was really handy. And sure enough, when we're going through the RSIST or run-specific isometric training testing on the force plates, we saw that Maggie's left leg was significantly weaker than the right, par for the course. But more importantly for me anyway, in terms of getting her back to high performance sport, the amount of force she was able to use, or how quickly she was able to use her strength at 100 and 200 millisecond time points was really significantly down, both compared to the right, but also compared to where she had been before. So that was our key thing there, was improving the strength. And with that comes an improvement in how strong and how quickly you can use that strength, but then also really integrating some exercises into that help to prompt fast activation of predominantly the hamstrings we found. So that was the first stage, really, restoring range of motion, focusing on restoring extension to get back into the efficient gait cycle. So stage 2 then, this is really all about building brakes. So while we want to get athletes strong, fast and powerful, we need to make sure that they have an equivalent braking system. Super important here, because from a performance perspective, I'm always of the opinion that those who can brake the fastest can accelerate the quickest. Yep. So regardless of how quick you might be versus your opponent, if you can brake long before them, you've always got a chance of getting that first step ahead. Okay. Now if we build better acceleration on top of that, now you may be 2 steps ahead. you get the idea. Also tying into the concept of building better brakes as well as just a bigger engine, we need the sufficient brakes to go with it. From an injury perspective, a lot of injuries, especially knee injuries, can happen through not being able to sufficiently control the eccentric loading. That could be on landings, that could be very fast deceleration from high speed, that could be changing directions. So from an injury prevention perspective, building strong and efficient brakes is also a great idea and holds a lot of merit there. So in Maggie's case, the first thing we did with this was we started loading exercises like split squats and so on, just to make sure as much as we could that each leg was working somewhat independently of the other leg. And one of the things we actually utilized was slow eccentrics, which is not uncommon, no surprise there. But something that can be really, really useful in this situation is actually counting out the speed. So we used a 4-second eccentric, not because 4 seconds necessarily does anything special, but it does require a lot of eccentric control. The other thing as well, that as she's lowering down in that 3 to 4 second phase, I'm counting on the outside in her external environment, and now that turns into a skill because her brain actually has to control the eccentric lowering phase in time with an external stimulus. So we start building a little bit of skill into the rehab exercises rather than just do the exercise, get stronger. Part 2 of building better brakes with any athlete really is giving them a lot of eccentric control and then starting to stress test that, which is basically giving them challenges where they've got to figure out strategies to control their bodies, control their limbs eccentrically in a more violent or ballistic setting. So that could be some single leg landings from a jump. So one of my favorites here is jumping off 2 feet, landing on one leg. We obviously need to be working up towards that specifically, but that can be a really nice challenge, especially with jumping off 2 feet and a broad jump landing on that one leg. We get a hell of a lot of loading through the knee joint on landing, which is one reason why we need to be very careful and judicious with that kind of exercise, but also a good reason why we can actually incorporate this to really challenge timing and robustness through the tissues, through the knee. All of these ballistic kind of landings really help to prepare the athlete better for a chaotic environment in their sport. At the same time as building the brakes, we also started focusing on aerobic conditioning. One of the big issues I see with athletes, especially amateur athletes that are injured, is maybe they can't use a limb, maybe they can't engage in too much, but we can always find a way to get their heart rate up. And I think this is a great idea because you might have a layoff of multiple weeks or even months and then try and go back to your sport or go back to some training and you're completely out of gas. So I always recommend as early as you can do as much aerobic conditioning through your injury time as you possibly can, because when we get back to training, you're going to come back so much quicker and so much easier. For the aerobic side of things with Maggie, we simply used a bike that was much easier. She wasn't really ready yet for a lot of running, and we based the interval conditioning on some testing we did. So something I'll do as aerobic testing is a modified Cooper's test, which is a 5 or 6 minute run or bike test. Very, very simple. We look at how far you went in that time period, and then something that's going to be important for the aerobic system is how quickly did it take for your heart rate to come down from maximal at the end of the test down to recovered. I always use a range of around 120-ish for that as a number. So based on the modified Cooper's test, we're able to prescribe certain intervals, and then we would just be looking at Maggie's heart rate. How is she feeling from an RPE perspective, for example, after a certain number of intervals, and it's building up that aerobic fitness so that when the time came, we can actually then rely on that and start building some speed and power work. The next phase of our little project Maggie was basically introducing higher speed running. Now, when we first went out and looked at the testing here, we're just looking at how well is she feeling with the run, is she feeling confident? That's a big thing with coming back. We use video analysis from the frontal plane, so front to back and sagittal plane, side to side, to start looking at some obvious low-hanging fruit components that we could address and get some immediate improvements with. The biggest thing that really came out for us was a combination of lack of strength, but also lack of familiarity and maybe just a little bit of a lack of confidence. There was a short step on the left foot. So as Maggie took a stride through any kind of acceleration phases, and before her left foot struck the ground, she would shorten that stride up noticeably. The other thing as well is that as she shortened the stride up, she would be really reluctant to try and spring off the ground. It would just be almost like placing the foot down and then shifting into the other leg. So obviously that's something we need to address. Now, when addressing issues and biomechanical issues in high-speed running, it can be very, very complex. Sometimes it's way more complex than I'm able to figure out, but certainly with this low-hanging fruit, that was some easy fixes that we found. So something I used with Maggie was simply regressing the sprint and then looking at various skip and bounding drills just to get some confidence back, two, start building a little bit more stiffness through the ankle so we get a much better toe off position, and just encouraging her to explore some shapes and angles and positions through the skips and bounds that we carry over to our high speed running, to our sprints, so that we have nice toe off, full extension through the hip and the knee, good torso angles and torso stability. And then also the key thing with the skips and the bounds that we found was it really helped me get a better understanding of how to ensure that the foot strike was under her center of mass. At the beginning she was overstriding. When we have that foot striking the ground too far in front of us, we actually go through a braking phase, which slows us down. And consequently, through all this, Maggie got back to some high speed, just straight line running, and we found that she was able to take essentially less strides to cover the same distance. Now, taking less strides to cover the same distance in our case was good. Sometimes it's not so good because it's just a case of, again, people overstriding, overstepping. So you can take less total strides for, say, 10 meters, but you're not doing it right. So it's actually slowing you down. But with Maggie, we found a reduction in the strides over the distance we were looking at, and everything was looking good, and she definitely looked a lot faster. When we were timing her, she was definitely improving her times and felt quicker. Importantly, she was just getting into some training back on the court at this time, and definitely noticed she was feeling good on the court, which is also probably the number one key metric we want to consider in this case, is the athlete feeling and looking better in their sport. So we found really that Maggie adapted very, very quickly to the high speed running. And I think this is really just an indicator of what happens when you spend the time previous to getting into running, actually building the strength and the qualities required for high-speed running, because we had those. We knew from our testing that a lot of her strength and speed, rate of force production, speed of using that strength was there. Stiffness through tendons was pretty close to where we wanted it to be. It just needed a little bit of time outside in more of a different training environment to start getting a greater sense of rhythm and timing with that run. And that's really what the bounds and the skips really help with. And it meant we could kind of bring the two together pretty quickly, so we had already done the actual physical work in the gym and got some great results there. Part 4 is looking at how did we train Maggie in the gym, what kind of strength work were we using, and so on and so forth. Something I've been looking at in the last 12 months or so is looking and trying to identify, okay, what kind of athlete do I have? Do I have an athlete that is more muscularly driven? So yes, they're using stretch shortening cycles in their movements, but they're more muscularly driven. In situations like this, we might see an athlete in any kind of sport that looks really powerful as they're moving. On the other extreme, we may have an athlete that is driven more by the stretch shortening cycle and relies on tendon elasticity to move around. These people are typically looking very elastic, very bouncy as I think of it, and just kind of float. Now, showing my age here, when I think back to some sprinters of the 90s, we had people like Linford Christie, Maurice Green, looked like more muscularly driven athletes that would just drive themselves down the track. Compare this to sprinters like Carl Lewis, Frankie Fredericks. They looked obviously very quick, but they were just kind of floating down the track. So we have athletes that are very muscularly driven, athletes that are very elastically driven, and then we have people that fall in between. With the elastic athletes, typically what we're seeing with these athletes is they tend to have a narrower pelvis, a more acute angle or rib angle through here. Those athletes generally don't do well with heavy barbell loading, this kind of thing, so we need to load them more strategically to improve strength. On the flip side, over this end, we have these more muscularly driven athletes. Typically they would have a wider pelvis, maybe a wider rib cage, certainly a wider angle through the ribs that can actually support the kind of heavy loading with squats and deadlifts and this kind of thing we normally associate with strength training. So we can look at how an athlete moves. We can also look at just the general structure of an athlete. In addition, there are some nice little metrics I've been finding out recently when looking at force plate data that can give a nice indication of this as well. One of them is looking at a counter movement jump depth, and then looking at the counter movement jump height and looking at the ratio of that. And that can very broadly suggest that we got someone with a high ratio at this end or someone with a lower ratio down this end of things. Now, when we're looking at these ratios, what they're really suggestive of are jump strategies. So with jump strategies, something I picked up early from Alex Santera, very, very clever guy. He talks about these 4 jump strategies of, in a counter jump, we have low and fast, we have low and slow. So it's dropping down to a low position, and generating a lot of force into the ground through muscular effort, which means we're probably going to be slower. We've also got low and fast. So typically when we're seeing a low body position or low drop when we go to jump, we're relying on more force production from a muscular perspective. Or we have shallow and fast and shallow and slow. Now the so-called shallow jumpers typically are relying on more elasticity from the tendons and can really kind of explode up quickly. Now Maggie, when we looked at all this information here, Maggie definitely trended down to this more muscularly driven kind of athlete. So with that situation, we can look at things like how we make contact with the ground. So something I've really noticed is the more elastic, bouncy athletes like to be on the forefoot, whereas a more muscularly driven athlete tends to be driving more from the midfoot. So when we're looking at different jump strategies and different jump training, we might be cueing someone to jump from the forefoot more so to use their kind of elasticity, their bounciness. Whereas for someone like Maggie, we'll be cueing them to utilize more of a midfoot landing, more of a midfoot jump, and use that muscular effort that they're really, really good at. So when we're looking at how we train athletes with Maggie, we venture more towards some barbell heavier loading to build up that strength. In addition to the strength side of things, trying to make her more reactive, again, using some isometric work, some fast ballistic isometrics or oscillatory isometrics worked really well. And we saw contact times on a drop jump drop. But as with most muscular athletes, the contact times are nearly always going to be a little bit longer. And we might see this as well with sprinters. We might see someone running really fast, but their foot's on the ground for noticeably longer than someone who is, we'll say, bouncy, but they're running at approximately the same speed. And we're looking at different strategies of how to generate force and how to generate force quickly. So Maggie is to the point where she's got basically best force output, best jump heights, best elasticity, best reactive strength, fastest foot speed, and this kind of thing we've seen her before, which was fantastic. It would also be remiss of me completely if we didn't actually include Maggie's attitude in this. With any rehab situation, getting buy-in from the individual is going to be paramount. Maggie absolutely brought in, and those who know Maggie will know she's hardworking, she's determined, she puts in a shift, as the saying goes, and that really did lend itself to getting a good, fast resolution and getting her ready for the key thing we focused on, which was let's get you ready for nationals, let's get it done. And she did.